Hello, my name is Lola Akinloye and I am an associate solicitor in the London real estate team at Ince, and I'm also part of the Ince Africa Group network. The London real estate team advises a wide range of both UK-based and international clients, including individuals, property companies, developers, and leading entities involved in many industries. UK real estate can be a very attractive investment. The background against which transactions are undertaking is evolving, and we are seeing some change owed to the COVID-19 pandemic and the recent Brexit transition. As we are coming out of our national lockdown and the blurriness on leaving the EU is finally starting to clear, there is a renewed focus on investment in the UK economy. One of the lesser known facts in the industry is that in the UK, and in particular London, it's been an investment hub for Africans for decades. Nigerians, Nigeria being my place of origin and heritage, started making their mark in prime central London from the 1970s and 80s, and were in large part responsible for the large boom in ownership numbers in areas such as Knightsbridge, Mayfair, Hampstead and St John's Wood. Africans are an extremely well-travelled people and are attracted to modern taste and a modern approach to property investments. A lot of Africans remain very keen to maintain their long-standing Commonwealth connections with the UK by investing in one of the most important asset classes of our time, property. And in doing so, a number of questions and considerations typically arise, and I'll try to answer just some of them in this podcast. Before considering to more permanent moves, which involve acquiring property, a reasonable initial question might be to look at renting a property on a shorter term agreement or a shorter term basis. We typically refer to such agreements as assured short hold tenancies, or ASTs for short. And that leads me to my very first question. If I decide to move to the UK, I will want to rent a home. What do I need to know? Well, you want to make sure that you find yourself a good and reputable estate agent to assist you in your property search. You want to approach a firm or a group of individuals who are really able to put your needs into action. Location may factor on where you decide to live. Education, business, leisure may be the motivation. And so you should make sure that your location abides by those principles. Since the 1st of June 2019, most agents' fees charged in connection with a tenancy are banned. A charge to reserve a property is permitted, but it must be refundable and it cannot equate to more than 1 week's rent. Viewing fees and tenancy setup fees are also not allowed. You also need to know that since the 1st of June 2019, there has also been a cap on the deposit that you, as a tenant, would be required to pay at the start of your tenancy agreements. If the total annual rent is less than £50,000, the maximum deposit is 5 weeks' rent. And if the annual rent is £50,000 or above, the maximum deposit is 6 weeks' rent. The deposit must be protected during your tenancy, which means it must be put into a tenancy deposit scheme, and will be refundable at the end of your term, subject to the rent being up to date and the property being returned in good condition, allowing for fair wear and tear. Your landlord must allow you to stay in the property for a minimum of 6 months. Most landlords offer tenancies for a fixed term of 12 or 6 months, but it is of course possible to negotiate a longer tenancy period, possibly with a negotiated right to bring the tenancy to an end after an agreed period of not less than 6 months. Alternatively, you could agree to a tenancy which rolls over on a weekly or monthly basis, and these tenancies have no fixed end date, but your landlord must allow you to stay in the property for at least 6 months. Landlords in England must check that all people aged 18 or over living in their property as their only or main home have the right to rent before the start of your tenancy agreement. And there are 2 types of right to rent checks. There is the manual document-based check, or there is the Home Office online checking service. Now, your landlord can't insist on which option you choose, but not everyone can use the online service. The second consideration in moving or purchasing property in the UK is the following. I want to purchase residential property in the UK to live in or rent out. Should I purchase a freehold or a leasehold property? Now, freehold and leasehold are 2 of the most common forms of legal ownership in property in the UK. If you choose to own the freehold interest in your property, you own the property, the air above it, and the land it sits on. Your ownership will not be limited in time, and your interest in it only extinguishes when it is transferred to someone else. If you choose to own the leasehold interest in your property, you will own your property for a set period of time, perhaps 99 or 125 or 999 years. So long as the lease was granted for an initial term of not less than 21 years, it can in most instances be extended for a premium. Another consideration here. I want to own a freehold residential property. So what's the catch? Well, those wanting to own a freehold premises are often attracted to the perception of owning their property outright. And that often leads to the mistaken belief that they can do anything they like with their property without limit, which, as some find out the very hard and expensive way, is not quite the case. I'm going to explain why. Well, the first reason is, if you want to develop your property, you will need to obtain planning permission from your local authority. This requirement will restrict what you can do. Secondly, if you want to buy a property considered to be a listed building or situate in a conservation area, your ability to develop will be further restricted by the need for additional consents. Another point here, your property may be subject to historical binding agreements governing the way in which you can develop your property. You may also owe responsibilities to a wider estate in which the property is situated, such as an obligation to pay an estate rent charge. Now, that's not to be confused with rent, as you might know it. Herein, an estate rent charge is an annual or other periodic sum, which is usually very small, charged on or issuing out of property. And here, you may be planning to develop in a way which requires you to put your neighbour on notice and seek what is termed a party wall award. This moves me on to my next consideration. I want to own a leasehold residential property. So what's the catch? Well, if you own a leasehold property, you, being the tenant in this position, will, during your period of ownership, have to comply with the terms of your lease. Under your lease, you are likely to owe a number of obligations to your landlord and other leaseholders in the building. These include an obligation to pay what is termed ground rent to your landlord. Now, ground rent will usually be no more than £250 per annum, but here's a key consideration here. If you choose to finance your leasehold purchase with a mortgage, it is always advisable to first check with your mortgage provider that it is happy with the level of ground rent imposed by the lease, because if the ground rent is too high or the way in which it increases is not kept in check, it can affect both the marketability and the value of the property. Another key consideration here. You will be liable for a percentage of the cost your landlord incurs in keeping the building insured and maintaining the structure, common parts and lifts in the property. You will usually be responsible to the landlord for making sure your property is kept internally in good repair and condition, and you may require your landlord's consent if you choose to sell the property on at a later date. As well as obtaining consent or permission from your local authority to develop your property, your lease may also restrict your ability to develop it without your landlord's consent. Again, these are just a number of issues to consider from a property perspective. Of course, in reality, you might have more questions or might find it helpful to consider your questions in the context of other legal issues, such as immigration and tax. This is where you should refer to my colleague Alan Platt's podcast on the recent immigration changes to the UK, and also my colleague Roger Harding's podcast on the tax considerations on investing in the UK. I hope you found this podcast useful. Of course, if you'd like to get in touch regarding anything discussed in this podcast, you can reach me by email on Lola Akinloye @incegd.com.